Okay, well, we've had quite a few people join us, so I think it's a good time to get started. Those who are running late can catch up with the conversation as we go through. And anybody, if you do have trouble with any of the connections, because I know sometimes that does happen, we're recording the webinar and we'll be sharing the links with you and the rest of the alumni over the next day or two once we've had time to process the video and everything. Welcome and thank you very much for joining us today. We're really excited to have quite a few of our alumni on board with us. And I'm really excited to share that David will be doing our webinar today, talking about super platforms. And there's been lots of discussion in our League of Digital Finance Professionals on LinkedIn on this topic, so I think it's a very timely one. For those who don't know, David is one of our co-founders and our chair, and also chairs the BFA as well. And I'm going to hand over to David shortly to start the presentation. But just as well for you guys to know, we have the ability for you to ask David or even your other fellow joinees questions. So at the very bottom of the screen, you'll see a little Q&A where you can type in your questions, or you can use the chat box if you can't find the Q&A. It's easier for me to manage if it's all in the Q&A function there. So David, over to you, and thank you very much for taking the time today.
Sure, Sarah, thank you. And good morning or good afternoon to all of you. It's great to see some familiar names from courses and other places in the past on the list of participants. And I look forward to the chance to engage with you on a topic which has really become a key interest of mine over the last couple of years. And so what I'd like to do this morning, just to introduce the topic, is to frame the background on the story about the evolution of super platforms and their role in digital financial services, and then to kind of bring it up to date from some of the earlier work that I've done, connected to some more recent work, both with platforms, with policymakers, with some of the things happening in the environment around super platforms. Because this whole topic is evolving very fast as super platforms themselves evolve fast. So my hope would be on this discussion this morning to address these questions and maybe talk for about 20 minutes, 25 minutes or so, and then be available for questions and discussion that follows, because I'm sure that many of you are engaged in different ways in your countries or regions with this question, and I'm interested to hear about your experience as well. Excuse me. So let's start with, in some ways, giving the context for those who may not have it, which is the background of what are we talking about here. Let's update it with the recent story about Jamia, Africa's super platform, which had an IPO last month. And then let's talk about some of the things going on in the policy environment around super platforms in different parts of the world in order to get to this question of what should we be looking out for? What's next around this topic? So that's the game plan in the next 20 minutes or so before we take some questions and discussion. So here's the genesis of the topic. It really comes from this paper that I co-authored going back, I guess, almost 18 months now. It's available online for those who haven't read it. And as you can see, the title of the paper was not Super Platforms. The title was Inclusive Digital Ecosystems of the Future. What a convoluted name. And here's the background, the part that you wouldn't get from reading the paper, which is how the project behind the paper started off as looking at new types of technology and how those influenced the digital finance ecosystem. And that's why on the right-hand side of your screen, you can see an annex or an excerpt from an annex to the paper, which listed out these so-called tech megatrends from different sources, a PwC report and elsewhere, things like AI, AR, VR, all these acronyms, which you're probably familiar with. We started out by saying, what do these mean? And we looked at those, and the annex captures some of that sense of what was happening, including where it's already happening. And Africa was the geographic focus of this research. But as we did that, we realized that the real issue, as usual. So in some ways, not a surprise, wasn't the technology itself, interesting and fascinating as that can be. It was about how it was being harnessed and deployed. And it was in the context of thinking about the deployment that it became clear that some of the most compelling deployments of some of the most compelling technology here, like AI, for example, are happening in particular places. And those particular places led us to this kind of realization around what we called super platforms. We'll talk about that term. But the real point is to say that the term emerged from looking at technology and realizing actually where it was being deployed most powerfully was in the context of these so-called super platforms. So what do we mean by that term? Well, first of all, let's start with the term platform, which, as you probably all know, as people who work in different parts of the DFS ecosystem, the term platform is widely used and abused, right? Everything these days would claim to be a platform. And indeed, that definition is non-standard and it is quite wide. We really are talking about a form of exchange that connects two sides of a market. That's the most basic sense of a platform. And that platform can be purely technology. So Bill Gates, for example, has spoken about Microsoft Windows as a platform. It connects developers who provide their solutions with customers like you and me who might use that technology. But more interestingly for us is the market platform. And this is where this term super platform comes from. Now, it's not a term that we coined. I actually first saw it in a book published, I think in 2017 as well, on virtual competition by a couple of law school professors, the one from Harvard Law School down the road here from where I am. And in that book, they were talking about the unintended or unrealized consequences of digital for competition and for market health. And in the course of that, one of their main themes, in addition to looking at how algorithmic competition could easily become oligopolistic and could have anti-competitive features, but in addition to all of that, interesting as it was, they highlighted the emergence of the super platform, by which they meant a complex new form of potential monopoly, if not oligopoly. And so they raised it from a competition concern in particular, but the terms seem to have merit, and that's why we dug further into it. And so let's talk about what you see on the screen here. This again is an excerpt from the report that lists the market cap of what were at the time, so this is in the second half of 2017, the largest companies in the world by market cap. And you know, by and large, there hasn't been a lot of change in that. There's been a change in the ordering somewhat. So Google, that's Alphabet there, and Microsoft increasing further, for example. Apple touching the $1 trillion market cap since then and then bouncing back a bit. So there's been movement for sure. But in general, the picture hasn't changed remarkably. And the thing that struck us looking across this picture was that of these top 10, so ignore the 3 on the right that are put in for reasons I'll talk about in a moment, of the top ones, it was striking that at least, as you can see there, 7 of them were certainly tech companies, but actually were more than tech companies. They were all companies that in different ways offered forms of platform that were active in more than one market. So there we are at the definition or the root of the concept, which is the concept of a super platform isn't just that it's large. So don't be misled by what you see on the screen here about these are all massive companies. There's something about the nature of a super platform that can enable rapid growth. And so you can rise in a short period of time, like Facebook here, didn't even exist, 10 years ago, to this sort of scale. But it's not about size per se, it's about having platforms across multiple market sectors. Now, you may ask some of them, why are they here? There's some obvious ones. Amazon, an obvious one, right, with an e-commerce market platform, but also platforms in other sectors. For example, an increasing digital finance offering. The same you could say about Alphabet or Google, where it has a main platform. Most of them do, a platform in which they dominate the space, and then a number of connected platforms which have grown out of it. And that, of course, is really at the heart of this super platform concept, is the fact that out of some core dominance, data is accumulated that enables that dominance to be asserted into other sectors as well. That's what makes them super. So to put that here on the screen, the real point about the super platform is it isn't just about size, although it's striking that among the world's biggest companies are what we would qualify as super platforms, but rather at the center of it is the concept of having a digital platform that enables the accumulation of data that's relevant, which can then be leveraged into other markets. Now, since that time, the term has arisen from China, this term tech fins, which those of you who have done courses like Leading Digital Markets would be familiar with. It was Jack Ma's spin on fintech, because one of his claims was that Ant Financial in China is not a fintech company, it's a tech fin company, by which what he meant to say is the fin doesn't come first, the fin comes second. What comes first is the tech, the data. And in many ways, if you spoke to Amazon or any of these big companies here, that's what they would say. While they play in the financial sector in different ways, increasingly, Facebook we can talk more about, for example, it's not their main or only focus. It's a focus that has naturally arisen from the fact that being tech first, accumulating the data, has enabled them to build very strong competitive positions. And so, if you like, you could use the Chinese term tech fin in place of what we're calling here super platform. It captures much of the same sense of what's at the root here, but just take away at least this concept. When we talk super platform, we're talking a platform of platforms, the ability to orchestrate platforms across multiple market segments. Two more things to say just by way of background. The first is to make the point that it's not just about the massive ones, and it's certainly not about saying they are the only ones. The point here is that it's interesting to see how quickly new super platforms rise. So BAT is the acronym for Chinese super platforms, Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, two of which you see on the chart here, Tencent and Alibaba, as you see prominently. While the BAT trilogy in China are still very powerful in their market segments, China has in the last year or two seen the emergence of a new acronym for a next generation of super platforms known as TMD, from the first initials of those platforms. One is a super platform we've had contact with and will be working with called Meituan, Dianping, that's the M in the TMD. And this is an example of a platform that's leveraged its ability to be a Yelp type of service for restaurants in China into a delivery service and then into a financing of restaurant service in China. So that's why it's a super platform. Its business is built on client reviews of restaurants, but they have leveraged that into a massive delivery of food service and into financial services, which they offer primarily to the restaurants themselves. You may also have heard of China's newest e-commerce platform that is rapidly, it seems, becoming a super platform called PDD, which is kind of like the discount version of Taobao, Alibaba's C2C platform, and is known for essentially allowing Chinese consumers to unlock particularly surplus goods at outrageously low prices. And there have been Wall Street Journal articles showing people in rural areas of China sitting in garages full of stuff that they've bought because PDD has offered them stuff really cheaply. Not clear that it's necessarily always helpful, but they've bought it nonetheless. So the point about this is simply to say platforms can rise. And of course, that means they can fall as well. And so finally on this slide, just to say the reason we put Visa, MasterCard, and PayPal in the picture here is not because they are today super platforms. They are platforms. And in their particular spaces, card, Visa, MasterCard, PayPal, obviously for digital payments of different forms, they are powerful and dominant platforms in their particular geographies. One of their challenges, though, and we see this reflected in some of their own new strategies, acquisitions, is how do they leverage that dominance in particular niches into other areas, or should they? So the question I want to just put up front for today's conversation is the super platform a kind of passing phase where, because of the dominance of data in a limited number of hands, it can be leveraged by certain firms in powerful ways across sectors? And is this really like the conglomerate phase of industries that was big in, for example, parts of Europe or the US in the 50s and 60s or 70s, but has largely passed away in favor of specialization? So I put those names there just to put a marker on the question. But having at least described what we're talking about here, let's move on to update the story with the story about Jamia. So for those who don't know Jamia, here's a picture of their website. If it looks like Amazon's, or for that matter, AliExpress or something like that, no surprise, it is. It's in some ways a clone model, which was started in 2013 in Africa, started in Nigeria, now active across 14 African countries, but with the biggest presence in Nigeria and Egypt, a fairly small presence in other markets. Now, what's interesting about Jamia is, what does the story of a super platform look like when it's launched in a very different environment from China, with all the infrastructure and so on that's been built there quickly, or say the US, which was the soil in which Amazon grew as a dominant super platform in several sectors today. So Jamia is interesting because it has just had its IPO listed last month. And as you can see, that IPO was used not only to raise money, which Jamia needs because it remains loss-making, much as Amazon was loss-making, I think, for at least its first 10 years, if not longer, in fact, maybe 14 years, and only was the rise of Amazon Web Services, which has pushed Amazon into profit mode. Now, Jamia does not have the equivalent of Amazon Web Services, but what it does have is, one, a growth story. It's at the moment, the largest player in Africa in this space, but let's face it, it's pretty small. So when you measure platforms, you measure them by this e-commerce platforms, that is, by this notion of GMV, gross merchandise value, which is the value of the revenue traded across the platform, out of which a platform would then take its own fee. And if you look at that, Jamia today is a tiny super platform. Its GMV was less than $1 billion, but rising fast. And of course, it's that growth story that you can see here, which is what was selling in its listing and what led to the valuation of this company that's barely 6 years old, that has only 80,000 active sellers and reported just over 3 million, I believe, active customers, but valued this at over $1 billion. So what do we take out of this? Well, I think there are two interesting things. The one is that there still is an investor appetite for the kind of acquisitive growth story that says buy market share, even if you burn cash in doing it. So if you like, Jamia's listing and the valuation there seems to say, well, that strategy still holds, at least in some places. The second thing about it is really to look under the hood and to see how difficult, frankly, it's been for Jamia in African markets where the supporting infrastructure has not always been there, certainly not outside of big cities. And that's where Jamia's had to evolve, for example, on the selling side, what they call its J-Force, Jamia sales force of 100,000 agents that operate across different markets, online and offline, in order to extend the reach of the platform. Jamia has been pulled into logistics, obviously, because logistics don't always work well for delivery of physical goods. Jamia has launched a Jamia financial service offering around Jamia Pay, which you can see a kind of wallet feature, much like Amazon has on its site, all pulled into these other markets because of the absence of other supporting infrastructure. And so in many ways, it raises the question of whether venture capital, and now beyond venture capital, now market capital through the listing, is sufficient to finance the emergence of a super platform in a less developed market environment. And with Jamia, all we can say today is the listing seemed to show the appetite, but whether or not it'll be sustained, I would say is still uncertain today. So there's one update. The second is what we've been doing in the context of the Fiber project, which is a MasterCard Foundation funded project that BFA runs, is looking more closely at some of the small micro merchants across Africa and looking at how they were or weren't already starting to use forms of digital platform. What surprised us, and this was based on work done primarily in East Africa, Tanzania and Kenya, where obviously, as you all know, there's active mobile money, but still the penetration of smartphones and so on, while growing, is not necessarily yet the majority in those markets. Notwithstanding that, what we found, targeting in particular Facebook users in those countries, was a surprising volume of use of social media platforms like Facebook, but being integrated into business processes. And so we found a range of people. I'm going to give you a face. Let me show you this fellow here. So this is a man in Dar es Salaam who actually sells, basically, who delivers hot food to office workers, biryani, in Dar es Salaam. And what's interesting about that is just the way he's now doing it. He's doing it using social media platforms like Instagram to promote the food, and using platforms like WhatsApp as his kind of CRM, his customer relationship management service, dealing with customers. And he has seen rapid scaling of his business. But as you will see, if you look at the Fiber website for the more detail on what was behind this, feeling stressed. And so what we discovered here was, first of all, surprising use of social media tools in ways that they were not necessarily intended to be used. So this wasn't using Facebook Marketplace, for example, because that's not live in Tanzania or Kenya today, but it was using social media platforms for marketplace functions. And these are merchants who are not yet on Jamia, who don't yet see the case to go there, and are using these free social media tools instead as a kind of on-ramp for customer order taking, for promoting their businesses. This guy has seen his orders grow from 20 to 200 meals that he delivers every Friday under his service, with his special recipe for biryani that he can promote to a wider audience. So they're seeing some of these early benefits of these platforms, but they aren't yet big enough to register or to get onto the more traditional e-commerce platform. So what we're seeing here is the emergence of a much bigger category of merchants in Africa who, if you like, are below this tip of the iceberg. The tip of the iceberg is Jamia's 80,000 active sellers, and below that now are hundreds of thousands, we believe, of people like Moses here who are not yet active sellers on Jamia, may never become on Jamia, but they are starting to use digital tools in new ways, tools which they've never been trained to use this way, and as a result report feeling kind of stressed by that. And this is one aspect of the Chinese experience that's interesting, because in China the training that they've done is not so much focused on how do you teach people to be coders and so on. I mean, yes, they do that, but a very different proposition around e-commerce is how do you help people to acquire the digital marketing skills that they need. And in Taobao villages, these clusters of e-commerce manufacturers and sellers, there are these high concentrations of people who provide all the supporting skills like photography for online promotion, the digital marketing skills, even outsourcing forms of CRM, which people like Moses would be happy to do. He says he gets stressed by his WhatsApp going on at all times of day and night with customer queries. He would rather outsource that and stick with making the biryani at larger scale. And so that sort of specialization around digital commerce ecosystems probably will start to emerge, but in China it's been a fairly intentional emergence that we've seen there. So let me just deal with the last part and then we'll stop looking at our time here. And I see we're already on 20 minutes or so. So I said we'd update the story, and part of the updating is the Jamia story and looking at what's going on beneath the tip of the digital commerce iceberg in less developed contexts like Africa. The other side is how policymakers are responding to this. So in the last year or so, I've had the opportunity to get a clearer sense of what's happening there, and it really is fascinating. It reflects in some ways the divides around globalization today. So what's happened in e-commerce, cross-border e-commerce, is there's been this agreed moratorium for digital goods, where countries have implicitly agreed not to try to, even if assuming they could, extract customs duties on digital downloads. Now, there's been increasing dissatisfaction with the idea of continuing this. And so what's happened is at the WTO, the World Trade Organization, the world has essentially bifurcated. It's bifurcated into a group of countries. When I was at the UNCTAD's conference in Geneva in April, there were roughly 90 countries, not only developed countries like Australia and Japan, who are leading this charge, but developing countries too, especially in Southeast Asia and elsewhere, who have signed on for an e-commerce negotiation. But because it's been blocked as a multilateral WTO level round on e-commerce, this is now what's called a plurilateral round, meaning a subset of countries are negotiating among themselves. And we heard from that subset, the Australian ambassador, trade ambassador, for example, they invite others to join them, but there are another group of countries, roughly the same size, 80 or 90, more developing countries, many more African countries there, but also India, who are saying, no, we will not take part in that because either we don't feel ready for it, that's India's story, until we get our own act together, or because we're deeply suspicious that this round is basically just opening the door for Alibaba or Amazon to come in and to take the territory. Another interesting observation in Geneva was how this conversation is being framed around one of the flashpoint issues, which is now about cross-border data flows, without which you can't do cross-border e-commerce. So as countries have become more and more sensitive around that, of course, this image has been used of data is the new oil that's been around for several years, which has a number of connotations, not only as being valuable, but also as being like an extractive industry, which oil majors, the Seven Sisters or whatever, exploit in different countries. So what we heard in Geneva recently was an attempt to reframe that, certainly from the private sector side, as data as oxygen. Right? So think about the difference in the metaphor there. Oil is dirty, extractive, carries problems. Oxygen, well, it's what you breathe. You can't live without it. It's you want it to be clean and pure and all the rest, but it's not extractive in the same way. So those are the kind of flashpoints of what's going on. Let me just highlight one more, and then perhaps I'll stop here rather than getting into another area unless you want to. And that is just to refer to the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which was signed last year, but which last month hit an important milestone. Like any multi-country agreement, it's subject to ratification by the member countries, and it only becomes into force if a certain number of countries agree to sign it. Now, to give you a counter-example, Africa actually has a convention, an AU convention on data, which I think goes back at least 4 years. That was never ratified. There were never enough African countries that ratified it. So it sits there as kind of good intention, but nothing else. By contrast, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement hit the ratification number of countries, I believe it was 23, in April. So now this Continental Free Trade Agreement, which is largely at the moment good intent, is now formally on the AU agenda. And why I mention it here is because while the goods and services, all the traditional areas of free trade are quite vexed in Africa, there are very different interests if you're Kenya or South Africa in manufacturing compared to some of the other countries. But e-commerce is emerging as an area in which there might be convergence within the African Union around rules for intra-country e-commerce. And this is why on the agenda of players like UNECA and the AU is the idea of a digital commerce roadmap, which would be a kind of fast-tracked area of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. So we may well see at the international level a bifurcation in countries between the one group that is welcoming and reducing borders for cross-border data flow, reducing barriers, and another group which is trying to block it. But within that other group, we may see regional agreements prevail. Last thing just to say as a counterpoint, because this conversation isn't just about Africa, it's about much broader, I would encourage those of you who haven't to look at India's new draft e-commerce policy, which was published last month, and in Geneva they were talking about it. It has a number of features which follow norms, but several which go beyond those norms. So one of them is, for example, a strict separation between being a marketplace and being an e-tailer. Amazon is both. Amazon sells its own goods, Amazon branded goods, as well as hosting hundreds of thousands of small businesses around the world that sell on its marketplace. In India, they're saying you can't be both. Certainly not if you're foreign under FDI rules. They also are adopting quite a strong approach to the use of data about Indian citizens. So again, in most countries, the data regime works on a consent basis, a notice and consent. You tell people you're going to use it for this, you require their consent to ship it offshore and so on. India's going beyond that. They're saying the data of Indian citizens is an Indian national asset. So this is more like the oil story or the mining rights. And even if Indian citizens give consent, you can't use it outside India. So that's quite a radical concept, as you can imagine, one that the international platforms are fighting back on. India is also pushing boundaries on taxation and so on. And so we could talk more about that, but I'm going to stop here by saying to you, so if we just fast forward to what's next, I'm skipping over this, we need to be watching what's going on in the realm of all these rules, because if data is the oil or the oxygen, you choose the metaphor here, of super platforms, then the rules around which they can use it on a cross-border basis really matters. And so the enforcement of GDPR in the EU matters. In the US, there's gathering momentum around new data privacy legislation and even calls and agreements around it from players like Facebook to some extent. And of course, countries India to Kenya have draft laws in place separate from these e-commerce policies like we've just discussed. Open banking is something to watch because open banking inherently turns banks into platforms, whether they like it or not. And so watching the next movers after the EU under PSD2, after the UK, which is probably the most advanced market, in fact has a big conference this week in London on open banking implementation, and players like Australia and Singapore and so on. The next movers at a developing country level, countries perhaps like Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa, which are at least talking about that, could be important in opening the way forward. So with that, Sarah, I'm going to hand back to you and pause, and happy to pick up on a number of angles of conversation and even talk about the Furman report in the UK about digital competition if people want to do that.
Great, thank you very much, Dave. A really fascinating journey through how the super platforms have arisen and come to play, really. And we've got some questions that have come in. So some of them are comments, some of them are questions. So we have one. I'm not sure of the name because we've just got them joining us as a Samsung Galaxy. So one of our students. But their comment was about digital money payment systems now. Is there much scope really for analog money payments, or I guess cash payments, when it comes to these super platforms? And you sort of touched on a bit with Jamia how they're using agents. Is there still room for cash to be involved in these platforms?
Also, I think what's interesting is how in Africa, a study that the GSMA did at least a couple of years ago said that the majority of e-commerce goods, physical goods, are still done cash on delivery. In other words, somebody delivers the goods, a courier, an agent of some sort, and then cash is handed over. And that reflected a number of things. It partly reflected digital payment infrastructure, although that's changing in many places, as we know. More than that, it reflected a low trust environment, which is buyers who are saying, I'm not going to pay in advance for something because I don't know if I'll get it, right? And that's where, of course, e-commerce has evolved in countries like China by solving that trust problem. Amazon never really had it here in the US. It had a very generous returns policy, which said, okay, just trust us. Pay the money in advance if you're a buyer, and if it doesn't work out for you, we'll refund you very quickly. And Amazon built trust on that model and has done so very successfully. China, of course, was very different. They said, we will create an escrow system, which is, of course, what Ant Financial and Alipay and specifically evolved to be, an escrow system that said, if you're the buyer, give us the money, we will hold it until you tell us you've got the good, and then we will release it. So to the purchaser, you can't, as the buyer, welch out at the last minute. So I think the point of the cash question is, cash is surprisingly common still, but it clearly is not what super platforms would like to see. They don't like touching cash, right? They really don't like doing that because their business model is built on least possible friction for payment, which allows them to focus in other areas. So they've been dragged into that, but reducing the friction around payment, reducing the use of cash remains important. And that's why, in many ways, I think super platforms rely on an over-the-top play in digital finance.
Great, thanks, David. And it's interesting to note that it's not just about whether you can or cannot make digital payments, but it's also the trust issue that plays a big role. I guess the idea of, for me, sort of online shopping, coming from the UK, I've used Amazon quite a lot, so you had a good trust of the company there. But even still, I don't use very many online shopping often. Now here I live in South Africa, so it is interesting actually to see how those dynamics play out even in your own behavior. So we have another question from Maxime, and Maxime is asking, so Amazon took 10 to 14 years to become profitable, and Jamia only just started. So what do you think could help Jamia to increase its revenue over the next 7 years? And do you think Jamia can be profitable by 2023?
Yeah, so Maxime, I think that's an interesting question, and it's a core one, right? Because I think the question for Jamia is, does an IPO help, right? Because the big answer is, what does Jamia need? Well, they need deep pockets, because there's no question that in a less developed market, you've got to pay for your own logistics infrastructure. You have to build brand. You have to deal with very high returns rates. I've heard that in Nigeria, the returns rate in general, this is not Jamia, but in general around e-commerce goods can be as high as 40%. In other words, there's 40% of cases in which the customer, the buyer says, no, didn't want that, or it's not what I expected, or it's not the quality, or whatever, all of which is called burn for platforms that are trying to guarantee and perfect that sale. They don't get their commission. At very least, they might have to make good the loss, depending on the rules and so on. So if the IPO was about saying, let's raise a war chest that'll fund us through that, I think there's a very big question about whether it'll help or not, right? Because, of course, now Jamia is subject to the scrutiny of international capital markets. Every bit of its story can be watched, and those markets are not necessarily known for being famously patient. So I think there remains a big question about what do they need? Well, they need deep pockets. Will they get those deep pockets, the ability to raise more and more and more capital because they're listed? I don't know. It really depends on people believing the story. And that's why, Maxime, I see linked to your comment about AFC. In its countries that made it easier for cross-border shipments without customs duty and so on to take place. So if that were to happen, that would be a signal to the markets that would say for Jamia, game on to raise more capital and so on. But the same markets which fund you can easily turn sour on you. And as you know, in the US, even towards Amazon 10, 14 years in, people were beginning to say, will they ever get there? Will they ever get there? And only when they introduced the super lucrative Amazon Web Services, where their margins are extremely high and makes up for the losses on the goods side, really was market confidence restored to the level that has soared today.
That's really interesting. We've got another question similarly linked to that from Kombi Kaponda. So he thinks the digital super platforms are here to stay and not a passing phase. So he believes they're becoming more and more use in day-to-day life, such as buying food and shopping, etc., just as Amazon are starting to do in the US and Europe. So he asked, how can one invest in Jumia? Should you pay and buy some shares?
Yes. Hi, Kombi. Well, you can certainly invest in Jamia, the parent company, which is actually a German company, by the way, in terms of domicile, but now listed in the US. So now you can buy the shares, which before you couldn't. It was a private company, people like MTN were shareholders in MTN Ventures and Rocket Internet and so on, the German company that bought into them and boosted them. I think the question, though, that you raise is what could change the picture? Because yes, if you think that Africa's story will look like Amazon's story or Alibaba's story, well then yes, get in early, and Jumia is still early. And in 10 years' time, you would be looking pretty good. I mean, I wish I bought Amazon shares 10 years ago, right? I would, or for that matter, Alibaba shares when they listed, which was only 5 years ago in the US, that is, 2014. So if you believe that the picture can be replicated, yes, buy them. What could change that? Well, I mean, frankly, I think that Jumia is, as some journalist once said, waiting for Amazon, right? In other words, waiting for one of the much bigger super platforms. It might not be Amazon, it might be more likely Alibaba to buy them out, right? And that would be a logical exit strategy. So if you believe that, well, that might be an even better reason to buy Jamia, because then you will end up being swapped out into Alibaba or Amazon shares, and they do have the deep pockets, right? I mean, literally, Jamia's GMV is probably the equivalent of what Amazon sells in one state in the US, right? Like that. So as a matter of scale, that could be the case. However, if you think that there is a much deeper infrastructure build necessary, then I think you have to ask the question about where might Jumia end up best positioned at some layer, rather than being a super platform, but offering the core solution in one particular part of a value chain. So it might be goods in a particular sector, white goods, right? Which, like washing machines and fridges and whatever, which are very much an African middle class expansion story, buying them. And then, of course, you have to believe the logistics is good enough and the support is good enough. And those goods would probably be coming from China these days and places like that. So you'd have to believe that the trade wars and the trade barriers are not going to block that. So I think there are counterfactuals to Africa simply playing out like the Amazon story. The big question will be, I think, if the African Continental Free Trade Zone can make Africa an attractive enough market for the deep pockets to really invest at the level necessary. If it can't, the markets are too small to justify the big investments that are typically needed. So it'll be a much slower long-term process in which some players might not survive.
That's interesting. So we're still not sure whether we should go ahead and buy Jumia shares. I guess it depends on what you feel about the continent itself. But Kombi, maybe you could look into it for us and share your thoughts via the LinkedIn group on whether you think and how much you think that the shares are going for in terms of Jumia. And you were talking a bit about the continental, the free trade area and e-commerce rules. There's a question from Ashley. Is there any more that you can say about e-commerce in the African continental free trade area? What kind of rules are you expecting?
Yeah, so Ashley, thank you. The answer is there's not yet a formal roadmap for e-commerce that's been published. Instead, what I was telling you about is the sentiment I was hearing from the AU and UNECA, the UN Economic Commission on Africa, who are quite involved in this, this discussion when I was in Geneva. They held the first ever African e-commerce week in Nairobi in December last year. And part of it was exploring what would this e-commerce roadmap look like. I believe it was a very active session. There were a lot of people there. One of my colleagues was there. Obviously, people like Jamia were there as well. And so what it would look like, I think, is this. It would look like that moratorium I mentioned, which is increasingly expiring on digital goods, there would have to be some definition of what are African digital goods. And that's hard, right? What is an African digital good? There's this debate about, is Jamia African, right? Because after all, it's a German holding company started by two Frenchmen and listed now in New York. So what is an African company? You'd have to define that, the sort of local content rules, and then I think look at customs duty for digital, non-digital, and this question really, which is perhaps the biggest one, of expediting cross-border shipments of things which are ordered online. And that's where I'd encourage you to look as an example of one way of the future. Look at what Alibaba has agreed with Rwanda. Last year, they announced a deal between the nation of Rwanda and Alibaba, where they are providing, at this stage, looks like more technical assistance, but in theory would be putting in place the kind of warehousing in Rwanda that would enable Rwanda to be a regional hub for e-commerce exports to pass in and out of East Africa. So Rwanda would be like the, I was going to use the word Trojan horse, but I don't mean that, because it's not about, deceitful practice, but more about it would be the entry point into the East African community for e-commerce goods supported by Alibaba logistics at the back end. So those are the sort of questions that the AU under the AFCTA would have to consider in this roadmap. Levels of duties, definitions of what goods qualify and don't, what platforms qualify and don't.
That's great. It's so interesting to hear that Rwanda, has that investment and may become a hub for Africa. And I'm kind of thinking as well, and sort of we've got a question here that's sparked off my interest, but with all these super platforms, is it really going to make an impact on financial inclusion in any way, or is it just going to make our lives easier and more varied when it comes to shopping? Thanks to Masendeke for that question.
Yeah, let me scroll down. I don't see it there, but I get that.
Right at the top, David. It's one of the first ones that came in.
Oh, is it? Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks, Masendeke. So, yeah, I see it there. So I think the question about the implications for financial inclusion are interesting because, you're right, Sarah. At one level, what does e-commerce do? Well, it's basically a consumer boon for most people because you get more stuff more cheaply, right? And you get it more conveniently delivered to your doorstep. It takes out the friction of shopping. That's what it does in developed markets, right? The question is, what does it do for digital financial inclusion? So in the original report that I mentioned, the one I showed up front, that was our key question. Our question has evolved since then to our interest in what it does for other things like employment and so on now. But for financial inclusion, I think what's interesting is it creates a compelling pull use case, right? There's a reason. One of the big struggles for financial inclusion is, why would you want to be digitally included? Well, part of the old story was because your employer or the government pushes you, right? They say you can't get paid your salary or your government benefit unless you open a digital account. But as we all know, that led to people cashing out very quickly thereafter. What digital commerce offers is a use case to use digital money, because largely that's what it accepts, right? I take apart from the COD thing that I mentioned as being common in Africa. So it offers a reason that pulls people into digital inclusion because they want to buy stuff. And for me, far more interesting is because they want to sell stuff. Because as we all know, in many developing markets today, it can't be simply let them buy stuff on Amazon. It has to be, how do you generate incomes? And that's where the stories of these Tanzanian and Kenyan merchants are so interesting, because they are starting to use, with no assistance, digital tools to boost their businesses. They are starting new businesses. Some were importing goods from China and selling them, cosmetics, for example. Others were local, like Moses, selling his biryani. But this is the M-Pesa type story of a tool shaped to local circumstances that people then develop local use cases around in unexpected and unintended ways. And I'm more interested in that use case for digital financial inclusion, where those sellers now say, we need digital financial services credit to finance our business digitally because we can prove an income stream, for example, for the future. So that's where I think it'll touch financial inclusion.
And it was such an interesting story from Moses from Tanzania as well. It was interesting to see, how the creativity was there to use the different platforms that were already in existence to generate that business. And Graham Wright has asked a question that relates to that. So he asked, whether you think Africa's poor will use one or two super platforms, or will they be, able to use a more, sort of broad-based pick-a-mix strategy, combining, multiple different platforms? And how will access to smartphones and data, and, I'm going to add an extra one to that, the cost of data as well, also affect their behavior?
Yeah. Hi, Graham. I think that's a great question. And I wish I'd shown another picture of Moses. I've never met Moses. This was other members of the team who were doing this work. But one of the other pictures of Moses had Moses with 3 cell phones in his hand, right? Which he's currently using, which is kind of to your point, I think, Graham, about how people use multiple phones. So in African mobile money, as you well know, and others on the call too, how before there was interoperability, people engineered interoperability by subscribing to each service themselves and then trading them off, the same way as Moses has his 3 smartphones. The reason for that, in part, about different channels, different audiences, not wanting to get stuck with only one network that might be down, and so on. So I think the mix and match that we see already emerging there, I think it's primarily a function around these social network platforms that they're free today. So I think that's a big part of the appeal. But if you're Moses and you start to see your business scaling, well, suddenly you start having new headaches where you start to say, well, actually, now I can think about paying. What if there was someone who could handle my CRM for me, right? And CRM sounds a bit glorified if you're selling, 200 packs of biryani each week, but actually it does mean there are 200 WhatsApp messages that are going out between Wednesday and Friday, and probably some complaints that it wasn't hot or something that you've got to deal with on Friday afternoon or Saturday. So people like Moses will start to think about other ways of subcontracting out. Will he converge on one platform? Is there one platform to rule them all? Well, Graham, here's the thing I'm interested in. If you look at what these African merchants were using, Facebook wins, right? I mean, Instagram, WhatsApp, right? Those are Facebook-owned platforms. And as we see Facebook evolving in the current environment with a lot of pressure on their privacy settings and so on, they are converging closer to the WhatsApp type channel themselves. There's more tighter management across their 3 major platform brands. And now, as we talk about, and I see Fahad, your question about cryptocurrency, as you know, it's now open. It's an open secret about Facebook exploring adding a money transfer offer that could be crypto token backed across Facebook. So if all of that came together, then there might well be a kind of one platform to rule them all, in Africa at least, where Tencent or WeChat is not a dominant platform and probably could never become at this stage. So that would be an interesting play. And if I were Jamia, that would be the one that would make me most scared, actually. I guess Facebook could buy them out if they ever got into physical e-commerce, but that seems less likely than, say, Amazon buying them out. And then just to your point, and also Graham's about connectivity, yes, that's right. The biggest barrier is actually the cost of data today. So we see that coming down in a number of markets. But until we get to formulas which can be affordable for as much as you can eat, what we will see are the patterns that people like Jonathan Donner of Caribou have picked up, which is this kind of drinking through a straw phenomenon, a small straw, which is very carefully monitoring and measuring data as opposed to as much as you can eat on the merchant side, at least. So that's where I think some of the bundling, which could happen between platforms and network operators, that was Facebook Basic, right? Another reason why Facebook could have a big enough play here, if you could provide free data for particular types of service, for particular merchants linked to mobile operators. That would remove one of the constraints.
That's really interesting, thinking about how difficult it can be for connecting to some people, but and how that might impact on their use of these platforms to promote or buy them for themselves. We've got a question from MD Ashraful, who's asking if Amazon and Jumia, take this long to come to profits, what would the situation be for more localized platforms like in India or elsewhere? I mean, I know we've talked a bit about China. What are your thoughts, David?
Well, I think the question really is, what's the long-term market structure? Could there be one platform, one super platform, which really is super dominant, right? Which is, of course, the fear here in the US, where Amazon's share of online selling was, when I last saw, 60%, something like that, and rising. And again, remember, Amazon, it's marketplace and e-tailer. It's not just its own stuff. In fact, the marketplace share is growing. So the question is, would it look like that, or are there spaces for multiple? Now in India, which I think is your question there, inherently there's more space because already there's a fight on between super platforms. There was no one who got in early. You have Walmart added to the mix through Flipkart, and that's causing issues for Indian e-commerce policy because you already have, what's Flipkart? It was started by former Amazon people, I believe, Indian people financed in India and outside, and then bought by Walmart. What is that? Is that what? As you look to the future, I think the question for local platforms will be finding a niche that makes sense, because I really do think, back to Sarah, something I said earlier. Really, if you cut through the chase, these platforms offer incredible technology. They are the big investors. As I said, that's what took us to them from starting looking at all this advanced technology. They're the biggest users of artificial intelligence, of all sorts of cloud-based computing, et cetera, et cetera. But they are doing that in pursuit of a particular business model. And for local platforms, the question will be, can they find a niche around that in which they can specialize and raise the financing to leverage their own ability to meet local market needs? So it's probably a function of capital markets in each of the places as to whether they can provide enough local capital to back a story that might not be as convincing to international players who are looking for the bigger ones to swoop in and buy them out.
That's great. And we've got another question coming from Tim about financing. He's saying you're already seeing this happen with Uber and Jamia, but what are your views in these possibilities, and how does it compare to traditional MSME financing? Is there space for established financial service providers to play in this credit space?
Yeah. So Tim, that's a great point. I'm glad you've called attention to it, because it's not only Uber and Jamia, but for example, Amazon. Amazon in the US here has become one of the larger SME financiers from nowhere, right? So in a matter of 5 years, because it is able to see the sales which its small merchants are making through the marketplace, it's able to verify them, it's able to get a sense of customer reviews and so on. It's built an MSME financing business off the back of that. So that really just proves your point about, say, Uber financing its taxi drivers to buy cars, or Jamia that has started with financing of merchants. So that's an example of exactly the super platform growth dynamic. You start off selling stuff that gives you data about the people, or the drivers, or e-commerce sellers, that you then leverage into a financial service offering. And that's, of course, the Chinese, very much at the essence of the Chinese story of Alibaba going into Ant, and Ant setting up My Bank and so on, which is one of China's biggest MSME financiers today. So your question there is there space for established providers? Well, I think what's interesting is the ways in which, in China certainly, we see some of the plays becoming themselves platform financing plays. So when you think of P2P lending, you might think of it as being individuals who lend money to other individuals via a platform. Well, that's not the way P2P platforms are evolving here in the US and increasingly in China. It's actually banks who are saying this is a cheaper way to lend money to a sector where we don't have a comparative advantage, so we'll do it via a platform. So I think there is space for established financial service providers to play. I think it might be because these platforms do what they're good at doing. They create another platform. It's a lending platform that means that banks in countries like where Jamia is active, Nigeria, they say, here's an opportunity, Nigerian banks, come and syndicate financing, you take the risk. Because certainly Jamia is not in a balance sheet position that allows it to deploy a lot of risk capital. It has to do it very judiciously. So I wouldn't be surprised if players like Jamia led the way into providing vehicles for financing for established players that do have the balance sheet, do have the funding. And I think that's a very interesting and natural synergy.
And Maxime also picked up on that point, sort of talking again about, Amazon granting loans. So how do we regulate these super platforms is, from that perspective is Maxime's question.
Yeah, so Maxime, it's a good question, right? And the regulation question, let's just frame it because there are a number of dynamics. If you think of what's going on, and these of course are what these new e-commerce laws or policies, which lead to laws, are trying to do. So China last year passed an e-commerce law, an omnibus e-commerce law. And it's really interesting if you look at it because what you have to cover a whole lot of terrain, right? So there's a financing payment terrain, which they cover, but they say actually really look to the payment laws, which in China were in place. Then there are regulations around fake goods, counterfeit goods, and quality assurance on platforms and customer service and so on. That's another big component of the rules. And there's a whole section that deals with competition regulation, which is this question of what are you as a platform allowed to do or not allowed to do in competing with others who sell on your own platform. So those are all regulatory questions. Let me just focus in, because of the nature of the seminar and this audience, on the finance ones. So clearly the issue of regulating credit varies by market as to how regulated a credit offering needs to be. Normally what is always regulated is the funding of that offering. And that's where, of course, when I mentioned the P2P platform example, P2P platforms have in many cases taken the gap there. They have not been regulated because they've claimed, like Uber claims with respect to not being a taxi service, Uber is a ride-sharing service. The same, these platforms say that we are not banks, we don't raise funding, we merely link borrowers with lenders. And that's where I think we're seeing evolution on that front into wholesale P2P type platforms, which will be regulated, but can be regulated because of their scale. They look more like the story around off-balance sheet vehicles, which of course is a very vexed story, because when they're not regulated, we know what happens. That was 2008 and the last financial crisis when that happened on a large scale in housing finance and areas like that. But I think there have been some lessons learned, and I think regulation would have to play into that space of how do you allow new financing vehicles that are prudent depending on the nature of the investors, the fund providers. And that's usually the key financial regulatory question.
That's really interesting because, we know that a lot of the times, SMEs are having challenge accessing credit, and it may only be very small amounts of credit when you think about it, and having different ways for them to be able to access that credit could be a good leverage for, including them a little more financially as well, increasing their profits and their abilities to earn. And kind of linked through to that, we've got questions again by Ignatius and Masendenke asking around, how can we support these, the growth of these type of digital platforms in Africa that, try and challenge, financial inclusion, linking capital and equity, and also, how can these super platforms, address some of the challenges that we're facing, like poor communication infrastructure. What can the platforms do, and what might influence these kind of changes, David?
Well, Ignatius, I think your question puts a finger on the key thing, which is, can you really expect a platform or a super platform to do it all, right? That was kind of my question around Jamia, which is having to do it all in some sense, make it up as it goes along. And as you heard me say, I think there are limits to the ability of any one player to do that, right? But today, what we see is not so much a problem on the entry side. So there have been numerous studies, the one done by Senfrey, I2I, which found when they looked across 7 African countries, I believe, 277 platforms of different digital platforms active in different sectors. Certainly selling goods, but a lot of them were gig related, Uber related platforms for selling types of work. Well, that was transportation. Then they had a gig category. It was separate. So there are a lot of platforms that have started up. And in some ways, the Jamia listing is good news, right? The Jamia listing is probably to African e-commerce platforms what Comportamos, the listing of Comportamos, the Mexican MFI, was to microfinance going back 10 or 12 years. People like Graham and others of you would remember that, which is it said, wow, there's money here, right? And that created a lot of entry, good and bad, into the sector as a result. So I don't think we have a problem about getting entry to the sector. I think we have a problem about a sustainable growth model in Africa. And I think that's where it does take the 2 things that we've touched on already in the call, but let's just re-emphasize those. The one is there are very few African markets which are large enough to sustain platform economics, which after all are based on just a cut of the revenue, right? And if you're a small merchant, you want that cut to be really small. There are very few that have the scale to support that on their own. Hence the cross-border policies matter, the AFCFTA and what it says about e-commerce and creating an enabled wider market. I think that's number 1. Then number 2 is the national market logistics really matter, and that's data, access, and cost, as we've already touched on in this call. It's the logistics, which isn't just whether you have the equivalent of FedEx or UPS or whatever delivering in your market, it's whether you have a national address system which works. So that's where countries like Ghana have been rolling out new ways of creating essentially 21st century zip codes down to house level that enable things to be delivered without having street addresses in the same way. So those sort of initiatives, which are ultimately public initiatives, I think are the best enablers of longer term success, because there's no way that the 277 e-commerce platforms will all be able to thrive, all having to do this all themselves.
Great. 277, I would never have guessed it was that high. That's a very interesting number to share, and just shows, I guess, some of the challenges of, too many can make it quite difficult, but also the challenges of population size for business cases as well. And talking of sort of models and business cases, we've got, we'll do 2 more questions, one of them from Fahad. David, what model is better in your view, privacy focused or data driven by consent in terms of profitability for super platforms?
So Fahad, good to see you here as always. I guess I would need to understand what you mean by the contrasting of privacy focused with data driven by consent. So on the data driven by consent, I'm assuming you're talking about the notice and consent framing of privacy, which is very much the European framing, and it's in the kind of principles which have been expounded by the OECD and the Treaty of Rome and others, which have largely found their way into the draft laws that you see in places like India and Kenya today, and beyond that. So if that's what you mean by data driven by consent, I get that. And platforms can work with that, right? What you mean by the contrast, I'm not quite sure, but let me build on that rather to say what I would like to see, because I don't think data driven by consent is the final solution. I'll tell you why. It's because I think it's unworkable. I think that most people, I struggle with, managing my data by consent, even though the tools might be available to do that, because you're giving consent all the time and you eventually don't even care. You don't read all the notices that you get given. I mean, how many times have you read a privacy notice recently? The volume has grown because GDPR is forcing European entities or entities that sell to European citizens to come out with these notices, but I don't think there's any evidence yet that it's been more effective in making people take notice about what they're actually signing away when they consent. So my point is, I think the consent model has some deep problems in a world in which people are overwhelmed by the need to consent. So what I would favor is what's being called increasingly a fiduciary model. And I'm not sure if that's what you mean by privacy focused, but a fiduciary model recognizes that there are particular types of entity that, because of what they do, carry very particular responsibilities around privacy, around other people's data. To give you an example, lawyers, right? Lawyers in most countries are subject to a regulatory regime as well as a self-regulatory regime that says, when you learn stuff about your client, you cannot go and tell anybody about it. That's automatic. You don't have to sign an NDA with a lawyer every time, although you might, because there's usually a law or a code of practice that says a lawyer is a fiduciary in a certain sense of your information. They need it to work for you, but they can't use it for any purpose. And that's built into being a lawyer. So I would say we need to think about what's the counterpart of being a platform. What does it look like to frame a platform as a fiduciary of my data and to build around the platform? And I just think that's a more effective approach because we're focusing on the root of the problem, not trying to cover every single possible privacy application, which is so vast and overwhelming. We're saying, let's focus on e-commerce platforms and treat them like fiduciaries with respect to personal data, personally identifiable data, PII. If that's what you mean, Fahad, in your first thing, then I would be in favor of that, as opposed to pushing this consent-based architecture, which gets more and more and more elaborate, but potentially less and less and less impactful in terms of giving effective protection to people and their data.
Awesome. Thank you, David. And I know we're over time, but we'll just take one last question that came in from Alfred. And the others, I'm sorry if we didn't get around to all of your questions, but we said we'd finish at 3 and we're almost at 3:15. So from Alfred, he asked about Alibaba. Why did they partner with Rwanda and not in Nigeria, as the Nigerian market already is quite mature in terms of e-commerce?
Yeah. Well, Alfred, an interesting question. And if you're interested, you can look at that report I mentioned up front, which you'll find via the Fiber, F-I-B-R website, in which we actually looked at Nigeria. This was before the Rwanda deal, but we very much speculated on, Alibaba is going to come at some stage. How will it come? And Nigeria, as you, I think, are implicitly saying, is the logical one because of the size of the market, right? One of Africa's largest markets. So why not go to where it's biggest to start with? I think the answer why Alibaba went to Rwanda is different though, which is Alibaba's model of cooperation outside of China, or actually started inside of China, is close cooperation with the government, right? And so it's much easier, frankly, to deal with the Rwanda government that has a very forward-looking digital strategy that is quite coherent and cohesive around it, and easy to do a deal with, and wanting to do high-profile deals, whereas much harder to do a deal with Nigeria, just because it's bigger. The same would apply for any big African country. There would be lots of controversy. So when Alibaba last did this, the first country they did this with outside of China was Malaysia, right? Same thing. This was in the days of the previous Malaysian government before the change in it. There was controversy in Malaysia around this deal. Is it exclusive? And everyone said, no, it's not, but it looks like this is Chinese e-commerce coming in to sell Chinese goods to Malaysians. So Rwanda, I'm not sure how much controversy there's been, but the point is that there was a deal to be done. And I think that's the main reason why Alibaba went to Rwanda rather than to the bigger markets. And as I said earlier, Sarah, on the call, Rwanda, because it's in the EAC, East African Community, in some ways offers at least a toe into the bigger East African Community market, which is, of course, much more interesting to Alibaba than Rwanda alone as a small country.
So we're going to have to keep our eye on Rwanda and that Alibaba partnership and see how it goes.
Absolutely.
We'll have some interesting updates that we can share and at a future time, once they've had more of a time to get together and we can see where they're going. Fantastic. Well, thank you, David, very much. It's been such an interesting webinar. I've really enjoyed, and I see a lot of comments as well coming through from participants saying they've enjoyed as well, and thank you. So it was really interesting to hear you bring to life all the different components that are involved in the platforms and the things we need to think about in terms of success, market size, business case, regulation. It was really fascinating. So thank you for taking the time with us today, David.
You're very welcome, Sarah. Nice to speak with all of you, and I look forward to keeping going on this topic. We can do an update in 6 months, Sarah, maybe, because I can guarantee you there'll be more to talk about. Right,
I'm sure. It sounds very fast-paced changes that are happening. So yeah, we can definitely make this like a series. And what's also really interesting is we're hoping a future webinar in September will be with some fintech organizations. Some of the top 50 organizations we're working with a company called Mix. And I think that will be something that we can perhaps touch with you on again, sort of around that time, and see how those fintechs are going to be potentially contributing to some of these creating super platforms in the future.
Sounds good.
Awesome. Thank you, David. Thank you for everyone joining us, and we'll put recording up in the next few days on our website. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.